William Wilson brings native oral tradition to portraiture.
You know, as a poet, what I really adore in learning about your work and what you do is that it is storytelling. And it's storytelling during the process with your subject. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
It's about an exchange. It's the Critical Indigenous Photographic Exchange, CIPIX for short. So I invite people to come and I have a conversation with them, you know, generally around photography. I ask them how they'd like to be imaged, and it's a process that they're kind of engaged in, involved in, learning about. And at the end of that process, I actually gift them the original tintype. So the silver object that kind of holds their image. I grew up kind of cross-culturally. My father was Irish and Welsh, and my mom's Navajo, and I kind of moved between the Navajo reservation in San Francisco, California. I'm not fluent in Navajo. Certainly older generations in my family didn't speak English, and so it was really hard for me to communicate. And oral tradition, I think, is a really kind of important aspect of this too. Like, you know, there's a certain knowledge base or a repertoire that you have to be able to like share and exchange in order to kind of describe who you are in a way, you know? I think it's enabled me to have this conversation about representation, about history, about like the power of media in some ways, and maybe about like just a ceremony that happens when you sit down and have that kind of exchange.
That's beautiful. I like that idea of ceremony.
Yeah,
very much. What inspires you about using this particular method?
There's something just like beautiful about the alchemy of photography, I think, and silver, light, chemistry, you know, chance.
Could you talk a little bit about that, the tintype, in the beginning of that conversation with Mr.
Yeah, so the tintype is a historic photographic process. It was invented in 1851. The tintypes that I'm making, I'm using almost the exact same formulas, the chemistry, you know, from the 19th century. It's called wet plate collodion because I'm actually making my own emulsion and I'm making it on a metal plate, and the process has to stay wet throughout. After I pull it out of this bath of silver nitrate, it's light sensitive, and I have about a 10-minute window to go make my exposure and then get back into the portable darkroom that I've brought with me. All right. We've got the exposure and you can relax. The project is also about kind of relationships, about like, you know, what it means to have your portrait taken and what it means to be a photographer, kind of engaging people in this. So I get to run them through the whole process. They get to see, like, you know, a photograph being developed. At the end, you know, we both walk away with this this thing that happened between us, and also kind of a beautiful object, you know. So it's like a relational aesthetic that I think brings like the ethics of making images back into the process. That's why I talk about it in terms of a ceremony. Like it's it's important. It's
interesting to say ceremony and then ethics. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, what if an Indian invented photography? You know, would there be another set of like relations and traditions associated with making imagery?
Could you tell us a little bit about some of your historical influences?
I've thought a lot about the way that Native Americans have been represented historically through photography. You know, the first person to come to mind when you think about that is Edward Curtis, you know, and his project, The North American Indian. I think in a lot of ways those images are, you know, they're fixed, at least in American consciousness, about what like Indians are look like. I think in some sense, CIPIX is about responding to that and maybe updating it and saying, hey, you know, We're diverse. There's 566 federally recognized indigenous nations within the United States. Each one of those has a separate culture, language, economy. And we're all doing kind of really interesting things, and we look all different. That in itself is enough, I think, to fuel a project.
What are some of your favorite pictures and portraits, and why?
Well, one image comes to mind in particular of Joe Horsecapture. He's a curator. He was looking around for a prop, something to kind of help him with his image, and he saw my iPad sitting there, and he asked me if it was connected. He brought up this image on the iPad, and, this older Indian gentleman with a rifle, and it was actually an image of his great-great-great-grandfather, Horsecapture, who was photographed by Edward Curtis. And in the image, Horsecapture's holding a rifle, and he's doing that to signify that he's a warrior. Joe Horsecapture, who's the curator at NMAI, held up the iPad, and he said, this is my version of a rifle. I deal with representation, I deal with knowledge systems, and this is how I represent myself as a warrior. And kind of in one image, it encapsulated the whole project. I just finished 4 images that are kind of the next stage of the project, and I'm using media technology to kind of, I call them talking tintypes. Mm-hmm. So, a photograph is static by nature, but you're able to scan the image and it activates this media. So I have a violinist, a poet, a musician, and a dancer. And, they're beautiful images in and of themselves, but you kind of add another layer of information with you. And you have this technology. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's like my inability to be fluent in Navajo when I was a kid and not completely be able to articulate stuff to my family and friends the way that I wanted to is driving this kind of like research, and so now just with a photograph I can tell that story.
When people leave a Will Wilson piece, what do you want them to leave with?
I don't know, I hope they're inspired. I hope that, there's some questions about the history of photography, about the history of representation of Native American people, but also just about what it means to have your photo taken and what it means to be engaged in the ceremony that is making a portrait.